Part2 Chapter3 The Sound of a Horn. The first thing Turi did the next morning was climb as high as possible into a tree so that he could work out the right direction from the position of the sun. He soon set off again, wondering how long the journey through the forest would take and how close he would be to the Blue River when he emerged. The Blue River also flowed through the city of Daganot and past Castle Tehuri, Turi's home. Its source was in the Great Mountains, and it flowed eastwards before curving to the north, around the Blue Forest, and then to the southeast through the city of Daganot, and finally along the country's eastern border. Turi had heard that the first great road ran alongside the river for some way near the mountains, but he did not know where the river's source was, the exact point where the river began. From the city of Daganot to the mountains in the west was a journey of around 8 to 10 days along the Great Road. Turi had never been all the way along the road himself, but he'd heard about it from travelers and knights errants. His journey was sure to take longer, and still he would only have traveled as far as the mountains. The way was long and the letter was important, and the Black Knight had said there was little time to lose. The Black Knight might have dared to take the Great Road himself, but he was armed. The journey through the forest proved hard and slow. Sometimes he had to lead the horse, and, to make it easier to fight his way through the undergrowth, Turi tore off a large strip from the bottom of his robe. He had eaten the last of the fool's bread that morning, and so he had to survive on whatever he could find. Fruit and roots, as he had no weapons to catch game and no time to make traps. He encountered no one all day. It seemed as if no one ever set foot in the forest. On the fourth day of his journey, however, events took a different turn. Turi heard the sound of voices and of people making their way through the undergrowth. He quickly hid and waited to see what would happen. The voices moved away, but soon after that a young man walked by, close to Turi's hiding place. He was dressed in gray and was leading a horse. Turi could see that he was armed. He kept stopping and looking around, but he didn't spot Turi or his black horse. He soon disappeared, but Turi could hear him speaking to someone. "Where have they all got to?" "They're hunting further to the north," said another voice. "Have you seen anything?" "Nothing, and no tracks either. But it's hard to say. This part of the forest is so wild. You could search for days here without ever finding anyone. But he has to be somewhere. All I can see is trees and more trees," grumbled the other voice, "and thorns and creepers to trip you up. This forest is the perfect hiding place for a person who does not wish to be found." The voices grew fainter until Turi could no longer understand what they were saying. Then, in the distance, he heard a clear sound of a hunting horn. "Come on, Turi. Come on," Turi heard someone shout, and then he was alone again. Turi put his arm around the horse's neck and whispered, "So who are they? A hunting party? But what are they hunting?" The horse didn't answer, but Turi felt that it could understand him and that he had its own thoughts about the men who were roaming the forest. "If I'm careful, they won't see me," thought Turi. He sighed. Would it always be like this, having to be suspicious of everyone, scared that they might be enemies? He traveled on, even more warily, and saw no one else, although he did hear the distant sound of horns a few times. Sir Fontamar had a famous horn, which he had once used to summon his men to battle a long time ago, when enemies from the east had invaded the country. When Turi had been Sir Fontamar's squire, he had listened breathlessly as the old knight told of his adventures. Now he was in the middle of an adventure himself. Perhaps one day, he thought, my squire will listen to me as I tell him my tale, if I ever get out of this one in one piece, and if I ever become a knight. That afternoon, the forest changed once again. It became less dense, and the trees were tall, with straight, thin trunks. Turi could see a long way ahead. It looked almost like a vast, great hall with an undulating mossy floor, and lots of wooden pillars. It was easy enough to ride through, but that also meant that anyone could see him from a long way off, which wasn't a comfortable thought, particularly when he heard the distant sound of a horn again. After a while, Turi came to a shallow valley with a stream running through it, one of so many streams crisscrossing the forest. He decided to stop there and rest until evening. Then he would travel on in darkness, which felt safer. Turi crawled beneath a bush and fell asleep. When he awoke, it was completely dark. He felt his way to the stream and leant forward to drink. Then he spotted something strange, a glowing dot darting beneath his head. For a moment, he thought it was a firefly, and he reached out to grab it. But when he caught it, he found that it was hard and round. To his surprise, he realized it was the Black Knight's ring, which was hanging on the cord around his neck. He studied it carefully. Yes, the stone was glowing in the dark. It was a weak light, like a distant star, but still clearly visible. It felt like a final farewell from the knight with the white shield, a reminder of the promise he had made. Turi's eyes welled with tears until he untied the cord that slipped the ring onto his finger. This ring will protect me and guide me, he thought, and I shall keep my promise, no matter how difficult that may be. Turi covered plenty of distance that night, and he feared neither darkness nor mysterious noises. Sometimes he spotted a star shining between the trees, like a sister of the stone in the ring on his finger. He rode on in the gray light of dawn as the birds began to sing and did not stop until it was early light. After a brief rest, he went in search of food and then carried on riding. There was no one around, but he could not see any good places to shelter. Turi noticed that the land to his left, to the south, was starting to rise, and the wooded hills were becoming higher and higher. He crossed a path that led northwards from the hills, perhaps to the great road. A path meant there might be people around. I'll look for somewhere to hide nearby, he thought. There's sure to be a good spot in the hills. It's time to rest, especially for my companion. We'll travel onward tonight. Turi found a place to rest, and, unable to find anything to eat, he pulled the rope more tightly around his waist, lay down, and tried to sleep. As he dozed off, he heard the sound of a horn again. Onwards tonight, he thought, and he fell asleep.